The door hissed open at the count of 59, and the man who walked out was not bleeding the way they expected. He carried something heavy against his chest. 8 pairs of eyes watched from the dark behind him, waiting, not pouncing. "Get me some antiseptic," Daniel Reeves said, like he was asking for a napkin. Krell's claws had not left the trigger guard of her tranquilizer rifle in 11 seconds. She did not lower it. Her 3-part torso had locked rigid the moment the override codes flashed across the door panel. The moment this soft, sleep-rumpled human had pressed his palm flat against the seal and walked into a room that had already eaten 1 set of furniture and half a projector. Now he was walking back out of it. The thing in his arms was wreck. 80 pounds of obsidian teeth and laser-edge claws, the worst cub in classroom gamma, the cub 3 veteran instructors had refused to enter a room with. He was draped over Daniel's forearm like a toddler too tired to fight sleep, his nose pressed into the man's collarbone, growling low in his throat. Not the growl that came before a lunge. The other one. Daniel's left sleeve had been shredded to ribbons below the elbow. 4 parallel lines ran red down his forearm, beading slow and dark against pale skin. His right hand cupped the back of Rex's skull the way you'd hold an infant's head, fingers spread wide over fur the color of wet slate. Krell counted the cuts. 4, not 11. Not the 23 her training manual predicted for unarmored contact with a frenzied cub past minute 2. This was the part nobody back at the education authority would believe, so she filed it the way she filed every reading that didn't match the manual, carefully and with her claws still on the trigger. The other 8 cubs hadn't moved. They sat in a loose half-circle on the scorched classroom floor, ears up, bodies still, watching the door the way you watch a kettle that hasn't started screaming yet. The emergency net launchers along the ceiling stayed dark and silent. Nobody had needed them in 13 rotations. Nobody had needed them today either. "You went in unarmored," Krell said. Her mandibles clicked twice, sharp, the sound she made when she didn't have a procedure for what she was looking at. 60 seconds with a Class 4 frenzy event. No restraint harness, no sedative. "He just wanted someone to sit still," Daniel said. He shifted Rex's weight, wincing when the motion pulled at the scratches. "Most of them do." That was the wrong detail, the one Krell would turn over in her head for the rest of the day rotation. Not the blood, not the silence in a room built to record screaming. The fact that he said most of them like he'd already met 1,000 Rex before this one, in some other life, on some other planet, wearing slippers the whole time. Hook 5, CTA, intro position. I should tell you now, it does not end here. What he did with that book, and what the High Director did when he finally saw the data, comes later. Stay with me. Snap back. 3 rotations earlier, none of this had been true yet. The shriek tore through the reinforced corridors of Threxel Station, Kindergarten Unit 17, at 700 local, and the teaching staff suited up like soldiers walking into a firefight. Krell's chest plate sealed with a hiss that still smelled faintly of yesterday's glitter paste, scorched into the ventilation grooves from an art circle gone wrong. She had survived 17 moltings, 4 classroom uprisings. The great glitter paste incident of Cycle 8924, which the authority still refused to declassify. Nothing in any of that had prepared her for what walked through the outer door 40 seconds later. A man, yawning, scratching the back of his head with one hand and holding a steel thermos in the other, wearing flannel pajamas patterned with faded cartoon spaceships and slippers, actual slippers, one stitched with a crescent moon, the other with a smiling star, neither of them matching. "Morning," he said. Krell's mandibles clicked once, hard. "You cannot be in this corridor without containment gear." "I'm the new exchange teacher, Daniel Reeves." He held up a data slip with the other hand, the one not occupied by the thermos. "Paperwork's all there. I start today." "You will be dead before the second bell." She said it flatly, the way you'd warn someone about a structural collapse. Classroom Gamma has gone through 4 certified instructors in 6 rotations. Threxel Cubs possessed your force sufficient to sever reinforced titanium. Their play behavior triggers a predatory response to rigid posture and sudden movement. You are neither armored nor trained in combat stance. I taught second grade for 11 years, Daniel said, like that answered the question. I think I'll manage. The recruit standing behind Krell, Silt, knew enough that her claws still trembled inside her gauntlets, leaned close and whispered, "Is he emitting some kind of sedative? A pheromone agent?" "I have a thermos of cocoa," Daniel said, not unkindly, because apparently he'd heard her. "That's the strongest thing on me." He walked past both of them toward the classroom door before either could stop him, the seal cycling open at the sound of his palm against the reader, like the building itself had decided to trust him before the staff had. Inside, 9 cubs froze mid-motion. One had been gnawing through a support strut. Another had a smaller cub by the tail, mid-drag, mid-fight. All 9 sets of bioluminescent pupils swiveled toward the door, flared an alarmed blue, and locked onto the unarmored shape stepping inside. Krell's hand found the emergency release on the corridor wall. Her claws hovered there. She did not press it, not yet. She told herself later it was curiosity, not paralysis, that kept her hand still for those 4 seconds. She was not certain that was true. The cubs did not lunge. They crept. Slow, low to the ground, the way predators move when they have not yet decided what something is. Daniel lowered himself to the floor without being asked, folding his legs underneath him, setting the thermos down within easy reach but not offering it yet. He unscrewed the cap. Warm chocolate smell rolled out across the scorched tile, sweet and strange in a room that usually smelled of ozone and fierce sweat. The cub nearest him, Garina, the class alpha, the one who'd already drawn blood from 2 prior instructors, stopped 3 feet away and sniffed the air with her whole body, shoulders rising and falling. "Hi there," Daniel said soft, like he was talking to any kid anywhere. "You hungry or just bored?" Garina's pupils flickered from alarmed blue to a slower, curious shade. She crept closer, sniffed his sleeve, sniffed the thermos. Then she sat down hard, the way cubs do when their legs decide a thing before their head agrees, and put one paw flat on his knee. Behind the observation glass, 6 armored instructors stood with their hands on weapons they suddenly had no idea how to use. Daniel reached into his pajama pocket and pulled out a book. Paper, real paper, its corners frayed soft from 1,000 readings, the cover showing a small child mid-leap onto the back of a giant yellow dog under a field of stars. He opened it to a page that had been opened so many times the spine had gone white along the crease. "Max wore his wolf suit," he read, "and made mischief of one kind." Garina's ears swiveled forward. Another cub crept closer, then another, drawn less by the words than by the low, even rhythm of his voice, a sound none of them had a category for yet. Within 4 minutes, Daniel was buried under a pile of drowsy fur, one cub snoring openly against his shoulder, another gnawing his sleeve with teeth that could have taken his arm off, then deciding against it, then purring instead. "That," Silt whispered, "is not in any training manual." "No," Krell agreed. Her claws had finally come off the release switch. "It is not." She did not know yet that this was only the first morning of many, or that within 4 weeks she would be the one filing the report that broke every assumption the education authority had ever built this station on. She only knew that for the first time in 17 moltings, the corridor outside Classroom Gamma was quiet, and nobody had needed the net launchers at all. Daniel's first full day ended with cocoa stains on his flannel sleeve and a thermos licked clean by something with a tongue like wet sandpaper. His second day started with furniture flying. Not in anger, not yet. Garina and a smaller cub named Bok had locked claws over a single foam training cup, both of them growling, both refusing to let go, the kind of standoff that usually ended with someone's ear torn half off before lunch. Krell's hand went straight to her belt before she caught herself. "Don't," Daniel said. He didn't move from where he sat against the synthetic reading tree, its branches grown in the shape of some ancient banyan he'd probably never see again. "Watch." He poured a careful splash of cocoa into a second cup and set it down between the 2 cubs without a word. Garina's ears flicked toward the new cup. Bock's grip loosened a fraction, just enough for curiosity to win the argument his pride wouldn't. Within 10 seconds, both cubs had a cup of their own, and the only sound left in the room was happy slurping. You didn't break it up, Krell said. You gave them somewhere else to put the fight. Same thing happens with 5-year-olds back home, Daniel said. Doesn't matter what planet you're on. Nobody wants to share the only toy. Give them a second one, and the war's over before it started. Krell filed that away too, next to the growing list of things her training had never once mentioned. The cracked toenail happened on the third morning, during a game that had started as hide-and-seek, and ended with Daniel's foot wedged under a support strut, while 6 cubs piled on top of him laughing in a series of barking chirps that the station's translators rendered, unhelpfully, as delighted shrieking. He limped to the infirmary holding his slipper in one hand, socks soaked through at the toe. The medical bots chirped their disapproval, tiny mechanical voices, stacking complaints about cartilage stress and inadequate footwear while they worked. Krell stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching the readouts the way she watched everything now, half suspicion, half something she hadn't named yet. You still won't wear armor, she said. It wasn't quite a question. Armor says I think you're dangerous. Daniel winced as the bot soaked his foot in something blue and faintly metallic smelling. Pajamas say I trust you not to be. Cubs read posture before they read words. You'd know that. I know what the manual says about posture. Krell's mandibles clicked, slower this time, almost thoughtful. I have never seen it tested by someone willing to lose a toe over it. I'm not willing to lose a toe. He flexed his foot and grimaced. I'm willing to risk one, different thing. She was quiet a moment, then did something Daniel hadn't seen her do in 3 days of watching her stand guard over every interaction like the floor might open up. She reached up and unclasped her left gauntlet, peeling the plating back from her forearm. Underneath, a long, pale scar ran from wrist to elbow, old and faded, the kind of mark that had healed wrong because nobody had treated it properly the first time. Combat training, she said. Cycle 1. I was 7 seasons old. They told us armor was the only thing standing between a cub and the rest of its life. She turned her arm over, studying the scar like she'd never quite looked at it this way before. Nobody ever asked what happens to a cub who never has to test that. Daniel didn't say anything clever. He just nodded, like a man who'd spent 11 years learning exactly when silence does more work than words. That night, alone in the staff debrief chamber, Krell pulled the day's behavioral logs and found something that made her run the query twice. Linguistic complexity. Among classroom gammas, 9 cubs had climbed steadily across 4 rotations, vocabulary doubling, sentence structures lengthening from single barks to full requests. Cooperative problem-solving, the metric the authority used to flag developmental risk, had jumped by more than 300%. Cubs were sharing. Cubs were asking instead of taking. Cubs were, by every measure the station tracked, becoming something the manuals had no category for. She thought about the cracked toenail. She thought about the scar under her own gauntlet, healed wrong because no one had ever sat still long enough to set it right. She did not mention either thing to the other instructors at the next staff meeting, not yet. She wanted to watch a little longer first. What she watched, 4 mornings later, was Rek. He was the cub nobody talked about in front of the new recruits. The Cub 3 certified instructors had refused on record to enter a room with unsupervised. He'd come into classroom Gamma 2 cycles before Daniel arrived, already too big for his age, already biting through restraint webbing that held the others fine. The station's behavioral file on him ran longer than every other Cub's combined, most of it variations on the same 3 words: uncontained aggression event. He'd been quiet, almost sullen through Daniel's first week, watching from the corner, not approaching the thermos, not approaching the book, not approaching anyone. Krell had noted it and moved on because a quiet Rek was, by every standard she'd ever been trained on, a good Rek. She had not yet learned what quiet meant for him. It was Silt who noticed first, on the morning everything changed, that Rek hadn't eaten his ration block, that he'd circled the room 3 times before settling, tail lashing, ears pinned flat in a pattern the manual labeled pre-escalation, but Krell had started privately calling the look before the storm. She made a note. She did not act on it. There was no protocol yet for a cub who was simply, quietly, having a bad morning, because the station had never imagined a cub's bad morning as anything but a threat to be neutralized before it bloomed. Daniel noticed too, but he noticed differently. He set the thermos down farther from Rec than usual, not closer, and didn't read that morning story near him at all. He let him circle. He let him pace. He didn't reach for him the way he reached for the others, hands open, voice low and constant. He's not ready for touch today, Daniel told Krell quietly, refilling his thermos at the small kitchenette behind the observation glass. Some kids need the room to come to them on their own terms. Pushing it just teaches them their no doesn't count. And if his no turns into something with teeth. Daniel's mouth tightened, just slightly, the first crack Krell had seen in 3 days of relentless calm. Then I deal with that when it happens, not before. It happened 2 hours later. Rex's scream tore through classroom gamma, loud enough to rattle the observation glass. And by the time Krell's eyes found the monitor, he had already overturned the reading table, splintered one leg of the synthetic banyan, and put his shoulder through the edge of the projector unit hard enough to short it into a shower of sparks. Foam confetti from a burst training cushion drifted across the room like snow falling on a battlefield. The other 8 cubs scattered toward the far wall, pressing into a tight knot of fur and wide, frightened eyes. Krell's hand hit the corridor alarm before she'd consciously decided to. Within seconds, 3 more instructors were sprinting toward the classroom door, tranquilizer rifles already cycling up, the kind of response the manual called textbook, and Krell, for the first time in 17 moltings, found her own claws hesitating to follow. Because Daniel was already on his feet, setting his thermos down with a care that made no sense given what was happening 6 feet away from him, and walking toward the override panel instead of away from it. "Don't," Krell said, and this time it was her voice doing the thing his had done 3 days earlier, low, certain, useless. "He's past the point where words reach him. You saw the file. 23 centimeters of claw reach. Jaw force enough to take your arm at the elbow." "I know the file." Daniel's hand hovered over the panel. Behind the glass, Rex slammed his whole body against the far wall, screaming in a register that made the translators stutter and fail to render anything at all. "I also know what scared looks like. I just need 60 seconds. Krell would count every one of them later, alone, replaying the footage until the numbers stopped meaning anything. Daniel's palm hit the override panel before anyone could grab his wrist. The seal hissed open, and a chair came through the gap like it had been fired from something, embedding 3 inches into the corridor wall a foot from his head. He didn't flinch. He stepped through anyway, into a room that smelled of scorched foam and fear, and lowered himself down to the floor exactly where he'd be easiest to reach. Rex spun toward him, mid-scream, claws already extended. "Hey," Daniel said, just that. Quiet, even, the same voice he used for the cocoa and the book and every other ordinary morning. "I'm right here." Rec didn't stop. He charged, all 80 pounds of him, and Krell's whole body went rigid behind the glass, certain she was about to watch a man die over a classroom dispute nobody back home would understand the stakes of. But the charge wasn't a strike. It crashed into Daniel's chest the way a wave crashes into a rock, all force and no aim, and Daniel's arms closed around him before the impact had even finished landing. "There you go," Daniel murmured, one hand cradling the back of Rex's skull, the other already bleeding from claws that had caught his forearm on the way in. "There you go. I've got you." He started talking, low and steady, about a dog he'd had as a kid, a Labrador with a temper of its own, how it bit him once when he was 5 and scared, and didn't know what else to do with the feeling. How calm always came back if you just stayed still long enough to let it. Rex's screaming dropped to growling. The growling dropped to something that, if anyone in that room had a word for it, might have been called crying. Krell watched the timer on her wrist hit 59 seconds, and then the door opened, and the man who walked out was the one partition one had already shown her, holding the worst cub in the unit like he weighed nothing at all. "Get me some antiseptic," Daniel said. She already knew that part. What she hadn't known, watching it the second time through, with context now instead of shock, was what came after. The other 8 cubs didn't scatter. They crept forward instead, slow, careful, forming a loose ring around Daniel's legs the way they did every morning, except this time nobody was laughing. Garina pressed her head against his knee. Bok sat down and simply stared up at him, ears soft, waiting for something none of them had words for yet. "They're checking," Daniel said quietly to no one in particular. "Making sure he's okay, making sure I'm okay. That's new." It wasn't, Krell thought. It had been happening for weeks. She had just never been looking for it before. The staff meeting that followed lasted 4 hours and ended with Krell standing at the front of the debrief chamber, behavioral logs displayed across the wall screen, telling 6 armored colleagues things she still half didn't believe herself. Cooperative problem-solving up, voluntary apologies, an entirely new behavior the manual had no entry for. Felra, the most senior instructor on the unit, sat through the whole briefing with her helmet off for the first time anyone could remember, watching the footage of Rek curled against Daniel's chest on a loop. "He bit through restraint webbing rated for combat-grade plating," Felra said finally, "and he let a man in pajamas hold him like an infant." "Same cub," Krell said. "Different room to be in." 3 days later, the fire alarm went off for a scheduled drill, and Daniel clapped his hands twice. 9 cubs formed a line without a single growl, filed toward the evacuation corridor in an orderly row, and stood there waiting, patient as soldiers, while 2 armored recruits stood frozen behind them in disbelief. That should have been the quiet end of it. It wasn't. High Director Sorlin Voskar arrived on the station 2 rotations later, and he did not arrive quietly. His ceremonial battle armor was the kind built for parades, not classrooms, polished obsidian plating threaded with gold filigree, bioluminescent rank stripes along both shoulders, pulsing a slow, deliberate crimson that Krell recognized, even from across the corridor, as the color Threxel officers used when they wanted a room to feel small. He moved with the rigid precision of a man who had never once let his guard slip, even here, even in a hallway lined with finger paintings. "I have reviewed the incident logs," Sorlin said, voice like gravel dragged across hull plate, his twin mandibles clicking sharp and fast. 47 commendations on my record, and not one of them prepared me for what I am reading. You have removed chaos from a critical development environment." Daniel set his thermos down on the small table outside the classroom, unhurried, the way you'd set down a cup before a conversation you'd already half rehearsed. "I haven't removed anything. The authorities' data shows aggression metrics dropping across every tracked category." Sorlin's compound eyes caught the corridor light and scattered it in 100 fractured points. "Threxel cubs are bred for resilience, for survival under pressure. You are softening them, Instructor Reeves, and softness in this species has historically preceded extinction." "Define soft." Daniel's voice didn't rise, but something in it had gone very still, the same stillness Krell had seen the moment he'd walked through Rek's door. "Because from where I'm standing, I watched a Cub 3 certified instructors refuse to be alone with Chews on his own, to stop screaming and ask for help instead. That's not soft. That's the opposite of soft. That's what strength actually looks like when nobody's forcing it." Sorlin's mandibles clicked once, slow this time. He did not answer immediately. Krell, standing 3 feet behind him, found herself holding still in a way that had nothing to do with rank. This was the moment the whole rotation had been building toward without her noticing it happen, she realized. Not the frenzy, not the fire drill. This. Because Sorlin had not come here for a routine inspection. He had come here, Krell understood now, watching the way his data slate trembled almost imperceptibly in his offhand. Because somewhere above even his 47 commendations, someone had asked him a question he didn't have an answer for either, and he had decided the only way to get one was to see it himself. "Show me," Sorlin said, not a demand, something closer underneath the gravel to a request. Show me what you mean. Sorlin's request hung in the corridor, and Daniel answered it the only way he knew how. He rolled up his sleeve. The scratches from Rex's frenzy were still healing, 4 thin red lines across his forearm, scabbed dark against pale skin. Beneath them, older marks showed through, a faded bite scar near the wrist, a yellowing bruise along his shin where a cub's tail had caught him weeks back. The limp he'd been hiding in his walk for 3 days now finally explained. I'm not going to pretend none of this happened, Daniel said. Every one of these marks is real. I earned every single one of them. Sorlin's compound eyes moved slowly across the scars, fractured light scattering with each small shift of his head. And you call this success? I call it honest. Daniel let his sleeve fall back down. You want to know what soft looks like? Soft is a system so scared of weakness it can't tell the difference between a cub throwing a tantrum and a cub asking for help. I'm not the one who removed chaos, Director. Rex still has every bit of fire he started with. He just finally has somewhere safe to put it down when it gets too heavy to carry. Krell stepped forward before she decided to speak, the way she'd stepped forward at the alarm panel 2 rotations earlier, except this time there was no override to second guess. Linguistic complexity doubled in 4 weeks, Director. Cooperative behavior tripled. They apologize now. Voluntarily. There's no entry for that in any manual you or I were ever issued. They resolved a block dispute themselves yesterday, Silt added, quieter but steady, without anyone stepping in. Sorlin's mandibles clicked. Once, the sound Krell had learned over 3 weeks meant a man recalculating something he'd been certain of for 47 commendations worth of career. He said nothing for a long moment. The data slate in his offhand had stopped trembling. They didn't get less aggressive, Daniel said, soft now, the same voice he used for cubs mid-storm. They got safe enough to stop showing it every second. They got safe enough to rest. 3 short beats, plain as anything, and they landed in the corridor like a verdict nobody had to read aloud twice. Sorlin looked past them, through the observation glass, where Classroom Gamma sat in unusual quiet for the middle of a rotation. Rek was curled against the base of the reading tree, half asleep, one paw resting on Garina's tail. The other cubs were scattered nearby in loose, unconcerned heaps, the kind of stillness no training manual on this station had ever described as a goal worth reaching for. He turned without another word and walked back down the corridor the way he'd come, ceremonial armor catching the light in slow, deliberate flashes, and did not look back. Krell exhaled something she hadn't realized she'd been holding since the alarm went off. That's it. No order, no formal review. He's not the kind of man who admits he was wrong out loud, Daniel said, watching the obsidian shape recede down the hall. Give him time. He just watched his whole worldview lose an argument it didn't know it was having. She believed him, mostly because she'd watched it happen to herself the same way, one quiet morning at a time, none of it loud enough to notice, until it had already finished rearranging everything she thought she understood. The supply cabinet got opened the following rotation, more out of habit than need. Inside, the emergency adhesive foam sat expired, never deployed, dust gathering on canisters built for a war that had stopped needing fighting. The net launchers along the classroom ceiling hadn't fired in longer than anyone could remember now. What the cabinet actually held, behind all that unused armor-grade equipment, was a half-empty box of crayons and a bag of marshmallows somebody had smuggled in for cocoa nights and never told the records department about. Krell found Daniel there, restocking his thermos, his sleeves still rolled up, scars on full display for the first time without him bothering to hide them. I have something for you, she said, and held out a small parcel wrapped in plain cloth. Inside were slippers, hand-stitched, the wool dense enough to survive a Threxel winter, patterned with small embroidered stars across the toe. Not store-bought, made. They didn't match the ones you had, she said, almost gruff about it, like admitting the effort cost her something. Seemed like an oversight worth fixing. Daniel turned them over in his hands, smiling the way he smiled at a sleepy cub finally letting go of a fight. You made these yourself. I unmade a perfectly good combat glove to do it. Her mandibles clicked, and for the first time since Krell had survived 17 moltings, the sound carried something closer to a laugh than a warning. By the end of the week, half the staff had traded their helmets for soft vests during morning sessions, plating left hanging on hooks along the back wall like old uniforms nobody needed anymore. Felra read aloud to a small cluster of cubs every morning now, voice still halting over the unfamiliar rhythm of storybook language, but steady enough that none of them flinched at her unarmored hands. New recruits arrived the following rotation, and instead of combat drills, Krell walked them straight into classroom gamma during quiet hour, the deep end of calm before anyone handed them a weapon. One of them asked, nervous, whether they'd be issued restraint gear. Eventually, Krell said, not today. That evening, the last reading of the rotation wound down slow, cubs settling one by one into the kind of pile that had once seemed impossible inside a room built for combat readiness. Daniel read the final page the way he always did, voice low, unhurried, the paper book soft and worn in his hands, tape gleaming faintly along its spine under the station's evening lights. Rex stirred once, pressed his head against Daniel's knee, and went still again. Daniel closed the book and tucked it beneath his arm, the same way he had on the very first morning, except the cover no longer looked quite so foreign here. The small child on the Stardog, now as familiar to this room as the scorch marks fading slowly from the floor tiles. The cubs curled closer around him, not because they feared the wild anymore, but because they had finally met someone who understood it. Through the observation glass, Saulin Voskar passed by on his way to the transport bay, ceremonial armor traded that day for a plain travel coat. He slowed for a moment at the window, looked at the sleeping pile of apex predators and the man in faded flannel sitting at the center of them, and gave one short nod before continuing on, his footsteps fading down the corridor until the station fell quiet again. The battle suits hung unused on their hooks along the wall, gathering the same dust as the foam canisters in the supply cabinet, and outside the classroom door, a single pair of mismatched slippers sat beside a new, hand-stitched pair, side by side on the cold tile floor.